Hi everyone. If you don't already know me, my name's Polly Collingridge and I'm the General Manager of the Cultural Intelligence Centre UK. I'm based in London and I'm really delighted and honoured to be joined by my esteemed panelists, also based in the UK. I don't know if this is a first, it's a fully UK operated webinar, with the exception of Tristan, who's dialing in from Michigan. So I'm going to not say any more at the moment. I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll start, please, with Advita. If you could just introduce yourself. I think you're known to quite a few on the call, but not to others. So.
Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Advita Patel, and I am tuning in from the very rainy north of England, Manchester. I am a communications and confidence consultant. I own my own consultancy called Treble, which is just peeking behind me there. We're an internal communications and employee experience consultancy where we help organisations build confident workplaces so people can be their best selves. I'm also just recently got my certification in Teams in CQ, and 2 years ago I got my assessor certification. So cultural intelligence is definitely something that I work on day with my clients and my coachees, and I'm excited to share with you how we can use it in communications as well.
Thank you so much, Avita. Sarah.
Oh, it's always hard to follow you, Advita, because you do that so well. I am Sarah Black. I am a communications and cultural intelligence consultant. My business is called ATHRU or ARU, which is the Irish word for change, and I help organizations and individuals transform how they communicate across cultures, whatever that might look like, whether that is national, regional, organizational cultures within organizations, or just the different identities that we hold and bring. And I do that through consulting, training, and communications workshops. And it is a delight to be here with my very good friends Advita and Polly.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So today, as I think you all know, we're going to be talking about communication in its many forms. And if there's one thing that I think we can probably all agree on, it's that we're all communicators. We all want to get our messages across. We all want those messages to land. We all have things to say. But the problem is, as soon as we start to attempt to communicate, we reveal our not only our similarities, but our differences. And that might show up in the words we use, the different words we use, the gestures we make or don't make, the questions we ask or maybe don't ask, the use of silence or not, and just generally the narratives that we tell ourselves about, especially in the workplace, about confidence and success and leadership and teamwork and all of that stuff. So communication is essentially culture bound, and that's where cultural intelligence comes in. Very conscious that we have a lot of people on this call, some of whom, and many of whom probably already know a lot about culture and cultural intelligence, and for others it's something new. So in the spirit of cultural intelligence, I want to put myself in the seat of someone who doesn't quite know what we're talking about and just give you a super fast overview. When we are sitting here talking about culture, we're talking about the shared pattern of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors that distinguish one group from another. We're talking about the taken for granted ways we think and behave, and we could be talking about national cultures, we could be talking about generational culture, we could be talking about organizational culture, and many other kinds of cultures as well. And cultural intelligence, or CQ as we call it, is defined as the ability to relate and work effectively across these cultures. And it goes beyond cultural awareness or sensitivity. It's a measurable skill that predicts success in multicultural environments, whether across all these different sorts of cultures I've been talking about. And I have to just point out, because we will be referring to them quite a lot during this conversation, that there are four overarching capabilities to cultural intelligence. The first is CQ Drive, which is all about your motivation and curiosity. I mean, nobody really does anything they don't want to do unless they really, really have to. And I think this is super important. So it's about really connecting in with your why do you want to interact across cultures effectively anyway. CQ Knowledge, which is about understanding differences and similarities between cultures. CQ strategy, which is about our ability to plan ahead and adjust our assumptions and reflect back about our intercultural encounters and think about how we might do things differently. And then finally, CQ action, which is about, it's the behavior change piece. It's basically adapting and flexing your behavior in order to be effective. So that's just your super quick overview of culture and cultural intelligence. And feel free as we talk, if you haven't understood something and we're using some sort of jargon and you don't understand it, do pop your question in the chat and we'll try and notice that and give a quick explanation. So I think now we're going to kick off with the first question, which I'm going to direct to Advita. So just also to explain, our idea behind this conversation is to talk initially about interpersonal communication in terms of sort of one-on-one. You might be talking about your relationships in terms of your communication with your family, your friends, your colleagues, your team members. And then we're going to widen our focus and think more about what I've been calling sort of capital C comms, more like your wider organization messaging. So we're going to start off, Advita, with a question for you, which is about the lack of CQ in everyday communications. How and where do you see that showing up?
Such a good question to kickstart our conversation. From my experience and the work that I do, the lack of CQ is often in the small moments that we experience every day. It's in those assumptions that we make about what someone should know, the tone we often use without realizing how it lands with somebody who has a different lived experience to what we have, and how we often can sometimes default to our own behaviors and norms when we're interpreting behavior. And what cultural intelligence is really about, it's about being intentional with all of this. When it's missing, communication can become quite rushed. It's quite transactional. It can be rooted in our own kind of worldview. And that's when those misunderstandings creep in, relationships get strained, and inclusion can often feel quite performative rather than lived. And it's really important, we always kind of think about the big picture stuff, which it is important, but it's the everyday conversations we're having. It's the everyday moments that we're part of. For example, I've got a big issue with jargon and corporate jargon. I'm sure many of us have, because we use jargon from sometimes from our world. Polly, you said the three of us are from, the UK. And we love a bit of jargon in some of our corporate comms. And it's that jargon that doesn't make sense to us, but doesn't make sense to somebody else. So I was working on a transformation project not so long ago, and the change director kept talking about the cherry on the cake, let's put the cherry on the cake. And there was people from different countries as part of this global change that was taking place. And afterwards, people were like, what does he mean by cherry on the cake? Or let's top it with icing. And they're getting quite muddled up. And it's so, when you really think about that phrase, you're a bit like, actually, what does it mean? Like, how does it translate into realism of what we're trying to do? So it's just being mindful of some of the behaviors that we may think are absolutely okay because of the lived experiences we have, but it's very different culturally depending on where other people are coming from, locally and globally. Expecting people to speak up in the same way that we do. I talk a lot about confidence and how confidence shows up in different cultures. It's that assumption that we can sometimes have about individuals, believing that they may not be quite good enough or know enough just because their behavior is slightly different from ours. Anything from how they write emails to how they may contribute to a conversation in a meeting.
And if I could just build on that, if I may, I think the other place it shows up at Vita is how we hear people.
Yeah.
So sometimes our differences can get in the way because people express themselves different. Whether that's because maybe we're all working in English today, it may not be everybody's first language. And so that can become a barrier to how well we hear people talk about their experience. And that can break trust and break connection really, really easily as well, because
Yeah.
we're distracted by the difference and we don't hear the meaning and the intent behind that communication, whether that's written
Yeah.
or verbal.
Yeah. And we think that people are being difficult, right? If someone's different
Mhm.
from us, we think they're being difficult. And it's not they're being difficult, it's that they work differently from us. And
Yeah.
if we can reframe that behavior and lean into these, the drive, the knowledge, the strategy and action, it can help us have much more fulfilling conversations. We spoke just before we went live about how do we help people be their best selves? How do
Yeah.
we show up as our best self in the organization that we're working in? And how do we help others around us be their best self? And active listening. And I'm emphasizing on the word active because this is about listening with intention, not
Mhm.
listening to respond, which is what we often default to, makes a big difference, to your point,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah. And that's very much at the heart of cultural intelligence and practicing cultural intelligence in our work, is that we're all this kind of listening with also a bit of self-reflection and like, what assumptions am I making here? And how do I expect people to show up? And how might this be different? And what am I bringing into this conversation as part of it as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. It's all about heightening that self-awareness.
Mm.
But one of the things I think it's so interesting what you were saying, Advita, about people thinking about people thinking that others are difficult, not different. And I'm wondering, I think most people probably set out to, when they engage with people, they maybe think they are being inclusive. They may be, or at least they want to be, and they are trying to be. But what gets in the way of them actually being, if that makes sense, in
That
your
is a
view?
yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like you said, most people want to be inclusive, right? But wanting isn't the same as doing. And I will often say that to folks, the folks that I work with are not intentionally malicious or unkind. It's
Mm.
because they often don't realize the work they need to do to educate themselves about what's missing in that challenge that they may have with the people that they're working with. Our brains take shortcuts often. We're living in a very rapidly evolving environment right now. Technology has moved on so quickly that
Mm.
we're almost struggling to keep up with all the changes that are taking place. Our brains haven't evolved since the hunter-gatherer days when our ancestors were, their only task at that time was to survive and, as much as they could do, hunt for the food, cook it, sleep, get up when the sun rises and go to sleep when the sun goes down. It was a simplistic life at that time. And now our brains haven't evolved since those days. But the world around us has evolved so quickly. So we spend a lot of our time in our kind of relying on assumptions, past experiences, and our dominant communication preference because it's efficient. I love a book by a Nobel Peace winner, actually, Daniel Kahneman, who was a psychologist, a sociologist, I think he was actually. Sadly, he passed away earlier this year or late last year. His book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he talks about how our brains are wired. And he refers to them as system one and system two. So our system one brain is that fast, automatic, unconscious, intuitive brain, right? That we make those quick decisions. And the way I describe that is if we're going in a supermarket or the local store, we do our grocery shop really quickly because it's brands that we have depended on, we like, we've grown up with. And that's our system one. We're just quickly picking up things. The only time our system two will kick in is and system two is that slower, deliberate thinking that is based around data, insight, and information, is if somebody stopped us with a sample or if there was an offer on the products. That's when we kick in with our system two. We spend most of our time in system one. So when it comes to building an inclusive environment around how we communicate, we're often working at pace and very quickly and want to get things done. We have a huge amount of cognitive load in this current climate. So when we're stressed, when we're busy, when we're overwhelmed, we default to those poor habits, I would say, where inclusion is almost a side thinking trait rather than the main intentional trait that we should have. And we only really lean into it is when we hit crisis. And we underestimate what our kind of spots are, which are, our low drive, I suppose, in understanding what is happening with the people that we're supporting. and we make the assumption, as I said in the first question, that our way must be the right way because everyone is in agreement with that. So we have to move away from that system one brain when it comes to inclusion and be quite intentional with how we want, what does inclusion look like for you and your people that you're supporting, and what are the signals that are showing up that's demonstrating that you're not being inclusive, because there's always red flags before crisis hits. There's always is, are people quieter than they normally are? Are people not being innovative? Are people, keeping their heads down and not contributing to conversations?
Yeah.
Are people
Leaving.
fearful of saying something?
Yeah. And actually on that point, this comes up in some of the Cultural Intelligence Centre training that I've done and that I offer as part of the team, Holly's team, is actually using exactly that system one and two and Daniel Kahneman's work, but to make the point that cultural intelligence practice takes you into system two thinking. It gives you the tools to kind of do that pause and shift out of that kind of running, I call it kind of running just on autopilot into a more intentional kind of, right, hang on a second, I need to stop and think because you're working through this model of drive, knowledge, strategy, action, and hopefully thinking particularly about the strategy and the action as you go, right, I'm actually going into a group where people will not all be like me. Spoiler, that's every group. Um, and thinking about how might I need to show up based on what I know about who I'm going to be dealing with, the relationships I want to build, the outcome that I need, and then how do I bend and flex my behavior to make that a more inclusive conversation that everybody can get. I love that, Patty. Sorry, cultural cruise control. That's fabulous. We will all
Well,
be using that now. But yeah, I think that's a great analogy, and that's actually where cultural intelligence can come in and help you dial down the one and dial up the two.
yeah.
No,
And
I
it
mean, I
just,
should say it's not easy, is it?
No.
It is something you have to kind of be
Yeah.
intentional about. But the more you do it, the easier it gets, kind of
Yeah.
like anything.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Sorry,
haven't
And
seen
even
any
Vincent.
research yet that tells that if you do it all the time, it becomes system one, but I would hope that that is the case.
And also, we are living, we have to be realistic, right? We are living in a world that's rapidly evolving and moving very quickly. And we have to be comfortable with moving at pace because that's just the world around us right now. And if we didn't live in system one brain
Yeah.
as frequently as we do, we wouldn't be able to make decisions, right? We wouldn't want to
Mhm.
make choices, we'd be stuck. So it's about balance. It's about, like I said, it's about recognizing where do I need to be very intentional? What are the signals and the signs around me that's demonstrating that I may not be building that inclusive culture that I want to? How am I stopping people being their best self? What contributions am I making to this space that I'm in? I work with a lot of people who go, well, what can I do? I'm not a decision maker. I can't change the policies. I can't influence change this, and I can't do that. But we all have an element of privilege where we can control the narrative around us and make sure the people that we're working would feel included. And that is leaning into what you said, Sarah. That's where CQ is very powerful because it just allows you to take a breath. It allows you to reflect. It allows you to think about what people are saying so you can make those changes effectively and meaningful and with intention.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So interesting here. There's a comment from Vincent. Worth discussing. Linguistics evidence is that only 20% of speaking is actually verbal. But you've
Yes.
both already referred, I think, to non-verbal signs of whether
Yeah.
people are included or not included, whether they're understanding or not. So it's
Yeah.
about being
Body
really alive.
language, cues, context. Yeah, it's all part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I one of the best courses I did was a body language course because
Mm.
it's we spend so much of our time focusing on ourselves, which isn't, I'm not saying is a bad thing, but we
Mm.
do worry a lot about how we come across, what are we saying, what's happening, what's our tone, what's our behavior, how do we sit and observe. We don't look at other people.
No.
And to Vincent's point, 80% of that is quite telling before they speak. So we
Yeah.
need to be, and every culture, as which what CQ teaches us, is different in their body language, and that is a
Yeah.
clue often whether they feel accepted or not based on the conversations that are taking place.
And I would also say that since I started working on cultural intelligence, which I've lost track of how many years that is now, my observation of people's nonverbal cues is so much better than it used to be. I mean, there's still a lot of room for improvement, But it is much better because I'm more observant. I'm thinking more about what they're communicating with me before, before and during and after they speak, um,
Yeah,
which is a work in progress.
yeah,
Ways.
definitely.
So I think it'd be really helpful for everyone listening, Avita, if you can start us off with some examples of where CQ could be used to improve communication, whether, in personal life or a work setting, whether it's team communication or maybe just in leadership. If you can give us some sort of concrete examples for people
Yeah,
to come to, I think that's
sure.
always
Absolutely. So I've been thinking about, because I know I want you to give some realistic and real life case studies that hopefully people can relate to. So a couple of my clients, I'm going to share their stories. So one leader I worked with probably about a year ago now, realized quite quickly, she was new in role and realized quite quickly that her meetings were being dominated by colleagues who favored direct debate. They were very comfortable in being quite direct with their approach. They were very comfortable in challenging. They were very comfortable in speaking up, and it was seen as quite an invigorating team meeting that was energetic and vibrant. But she recognised that there was also a number of individuals in that room who were very quiet, who didn't contribute, who didn't speak up, who didn't really say anything. And at the time, she just assumed that because they weren't contributing or weren't saying anything, that their silence meant that they were in agreement to what was being shared and said. And then I taught her and explained what CQ was, and I did a CQ assessment with the team. And she realized she'd made a big mistake in making that assumption that just because they stayed quiet, they were in agreement. And when she looked at their performance and their engagement, she realized that they weren't as engaged as she would like them to be, and they were a little bit more reserved. Trust was a big issue as well. They kept things to themselves quite often. So she started to make slight tweaks. And Sarah's, I might be stealing Sarah's line here, but she adjusted and adapted rather than breaking, right? So bend and not break is what we both and others advise. So she started to do small shifts like sharing agendas, like the program a bit earlier. She asked the team to put in their written input before the meeting, so people could contribute. And from a written perspective, if they wish to, she invited conversations in the room. So she invited people who are a bit quieter to contribute, or she used to say that I loved your idea that you shared with me. Would you be able to bring that to the table today? And the dynamic completely shifted in that room, and people who never spoke up in that kind of energetic, vibrant space because they felt quite intimidated started to speak up and felt safe. And that's really important, that psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's written a book called Fearless Organization, if anyone's interested in that. She created that psychological safety by leaning into a system 2 brain, looking and observing about what was going on, looking at the data around her, and made those small shifts. And it's quite a powerful shift. And it completely transformed how that team interacted and engaged with each other without dominant voices from that culture taking over. And that was quite a powerful movement for her, definitely.
fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. Interesting. Bindu, who I know is based in India, says this is a common situation when expat leaders work with
Wow.
Indians. And we've also worked
Yeah,
with CQ Centre.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is very common
yeah.
in those kind of
It's
remote.
really common.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just what Bindu just said, I was just reminding me of another colleague, another organization that I was working with have got an office in India, and they did a focus group with people from India, US, UK, and I think Germany, I think it was. And the folks from India were quieter than the folks from US and the UK. And the director did exactly what that leader I shared did, and assumed that the Indians were more passive or more agreeable and didn't have anything they wanted to contribute. And what they didn't realize is that the dominance in that room didn't allow them to contribute. And there was shifts that they had to adjust and make to invite that contribution in. And it changed the dynamics again in that focus group about assumptions and stereotypes. And the unfortunate thing is that he was caught on the mic saying that before the folks could jump off, and that completely caused a mistrust in that relationship, which is difficult. When trust is broken, it's so much harder to fix. And you have to do a lot of work on your CQ to get it back to what it was before.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've got some examples, Sarah. I feel you might be itching
Um,
to contribute a few.
I can certainly talk about my own experience because I, in the last 15 years, have lived in originally from Belfast in Northern Ireland, for those of you that are trying to work out the accent. Moved from Belfast to Norway, Norway to just outside Houston in Texas, and then to a sheep farm in Cumbria, as you do. And I now live in Scotland. So a lot of personal experience of navigating cultures. So one of the things that I got, I worked in a nonprofit in Texas, and my wonderful manager said to me at one point, you know, you are very irreverent. And I will be honest, that is not untrue. Um, but I did realize that it was creating a barrier that my colleagues couldn't tell when I was taking the work seriously, but not myself. And they felt it was maybe not taking the work seriously, perhaps. And so I did have to bend, didn't break, still myself, but did adapt how I expressed myself. And things that I was initially uncomfortable with, like being called Miss Sarah, which I'm still uncomfortable with, but you do come to embrace those things and you do realize that you need to say, particularly in Texas, things like yes, ma'am, no, sir. That's just seen as being courteous, particularly if you're in a public facing role, which I was some of the time. So small changes to make people more comfortable, to reflect the culture, to adapt to it, and to overcome some of the barriers. I can also cast my mind back to facilitating a global group, ironically talking about inclusion. And it was an exercise which involved some writing, some reading a piece of material and writing. Um, and I remember one of the participants saying to me, I just can't do this in the time that you've given me. And it's because English wasn't her first language. And that was a mistake that I have learned from and would never repeat that again. I'm so much more conscious of that now. But we were talking about this before we came on, that one of the things I wish I could say to you, like, embrace cultural intelligence and you will never make a mistake like that, the one I've just referenced, ever again. And that's not the case. I mean, if that was I mean, that would be fabulous, wouldn't it? But it is a practice that helps you think about that more intentionally. And if I had been using the CQ framework, I think it is less likely that I would have made that assumption and assumed that everybody's literacy, reading comprehension, use of language was the same as mine. And I think David Livermore, who has written a great deal about cultural intelligence, and if you want to go and read one book about cultural intelligence, make it one of David's. Um, talks about, the fact that we do have to embrace this kind of fail and learn, because we're not going to get it right all the time. We are going to have to embrace that kind of growth mindset and be willing to put ourselves out there and have the missteps and take the feedback and do better, try and do better as we move forward. It's not a sort of a magic solution to all our intercultural, interpersonal, and communications challenges, but it does improve things. It does increase our chances, I think, of being more effective and more inclusive.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Well put. I think what we'll do now is we'll sort of zoom out a bit to a wider lens and think more on a kind of company-wide scale about our big C comms that I was talking about earlier. And I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of where CQ can benefit communication so as to be inclusive to all stakeholders. Because, like, how do you do that? There's so many different people. How do you get your message to work and land with everyone?
I'll start this, shall I, Advita, and then you can join me because I know you'll have things to say about this. I think that well, there's a couple of misconceptions sometimes. We talk a lot about organization culture, singular, and actually most of our organizations, unless they're very small, have multiple cultures. So that might, if you're in a big global, somebody mentioned expat leaders there. If you're in a big global organization, you've got country cultures, national cultures, regional cultures. You may also then have office and subdivision. So the business unit over here is very different culturally from, the way they do things. and their behaviors might be very different from a business unit over there. I often say that I am a comms professional and a cultural intelligence professional married to an engineer. We have very different attitudes to risk, amongst other things, and different communication styles. So functionally, you may see different cultures. So thinking about that, I think, is really helpful as a starting point, and cultural intelligence helps you do that. I think one of the things that comes up a lot is how we think about desk-based and deskless workers. And there's some great research out there by a colleague of Avita and mine, Jenny Field, has done work on this. And actually, that's a cultural issue. It's the way they do things is very differently, but yet so much of how we communicate is written by people who are desk-based, and we bring our own assumptions into that. We bring our own geographical national assumptions into that, and we can bring our own kind of behaviors around what we think good communication looks like. And it might be very, very different. So I think it is about flexing the message. I think the idea of there is one message and that's like was to everybody, we're moving away from that and thinking about adapting it to different audiences, thinking about what language it's communicated in, thinking about whether it's written or visual, even combination of those things. Thinking about the channels that we use. Vida can speak more about channels probably than I can in internal comms, but also thinking about how we use technology. And one of the great things about technology is it hopefully allows us to personalize and tailor things a little bit more. Um, but I think also being mindful, which again, coming back to the CQ model, thinking about our drive, what's motivating us, what's energizing us about these communications, what's the drive of the people we are trying to communicate and engage with? Are they motivated? Are they not bothered? So thinking about what's motivating them, but also thinking about the knowledge. Where are my assumptions and what I'm assuming I know and other people know? What knowledge do I need about the audiences that I want to engage with within the organization? Whether it's language, whether it's their working patterns, their channels, whether it's what they already think about things. And then looking at your strategy and checking in on what assumptions you're making, and challenging those and bringing people around you who will help you challenge them. And then the action is obviously the behavior. It's how do we bend and flex to better engage with different audiences. And again, I think Afida's point about jargon is so good and so valuable because that becomes part of the language and the culture of your organization. It doesn't mean everybody speaks it fluently. You know, my husband is also a diver, and he will come and talk to me about dive things, and I would just be like, I have no idea. Were you going down in the water or up in the water? So we all have these languages that kind of become a bit exclusive to other people, and we assume people understand it because they're in the same organization as us. But you know, if you're welding on a ship somewhere versus sitting in an accountancy office, very, very different cultural experiences of an organization. And I think we can all do a little bit more work to recognize that and reflect it in how we engage.
Advita,
I
do you?
was I was just going to add, to Sarah's brilliant comment that it's also very useful from an organizational point of view in change and transformation.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations that are experiencing this right now, doesn't matter where you're based in the world, and CQ kind of helps leaders recognize the different groups and on how they interpret uncertainty, and it can help reduce resistance because communication can sometimes can feel empathetic and considered, but we need to be quite mindful about the different groups we are communicating this change and transformation or evolution, whatever you're tagging it as in the workplace. So during restructures, some people will want transparency and detail,
Hmm.
and others may want reassurance and relational communication, right? And knowing that, to Sarah's point, if you're using, the drive, the knowledge, the strategy, and the action, can help you implement change
Yeah.
effectively. And I have seen catastrophic results through change because people have gone down one route and assumed and made assumptions and built their narrative around stereotypes that has caused the change to feel and has damaged the reputation of that organization. So it's just being mindful about how can I use CQ, to Sarah's point around the motivators, the curiosity, learning the different, looking at the evidence around you, the knowledge, and looking at what people are saying or not saying, and how do you form a plan and take action in the effective way? And it's really powerful in change and
Yeah.
transformation.
And I think to your point, it's also, um, and I'm fascinated by this, so if anybody else wants to talk about it afterwards, please let me know. That I think, and Vida, you've spoken about this, that trust and how we build trust can vary enormously from one cultural context to another.
Yeah.
And so, transparency versus I don't want too much information, I only want a little bit, how people think about risk, how they think about uncertainty, the idea of vulnerable leadership. David Livermore makes a great point that I think it's something like 90% of leadership literature and content is about individual-based societies. 70%, 75% of the world's workforce is collectivist. So that's people whose identity and sense of self is rooted in group and being part of something, whereas individuals are awesome people, by the way, because quite often we go, oh, being an individualist, not good. But actually, they're great individualists, can be great collaborators, great team workers, great people. Um, though I think we all have a bias to wanting to think that we're collectivist. But it's
Interesting.
individual goals are a big part of what makes them tick. And so we need to think sometimes about how we frame leadership, and how we frame ideas of trust in a global and, complex situations.
Thanks, Sarah. That's, yeah, good point. I've just realized I want to just flag that if anyone's got questions, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A, if you would rather than put them in the chat. Somebody's hand was up, but it's gone down again. But do, if you've got a question, just put it in either the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to it. I wanted to ask you, Sarah, about cultural relevancy. This is a phrase I've heard. I wonder if you can kind of explain what that's all about and what role CQ plays in cultural relevancy.
Oh, yes, in less than 5 minutes. So cultural
Yeah, you can
relevancy.
do it in five. You've got five.
Okay, I'll try. Cultural relevancy, which is a bit of a buzzword in the consumer PR and marketing world at the moment, is around the idea of connecting mostly brands, but not exclusively, organizations with, I guess, things that are having a moment in popular culture. So, not culture as we might think about it in cultural intelligence, which is the way we do things around here, beliefs, values, behaviors that are deeply rooted in who we are. Um, so, they're trying to tap into a cultural trend now, and that can be really, really powerful from a marketing point of view. And I was trying to think of an example now, and of course, can't remember one. Um, I think there's a couple of things about cultural intelligence and cultural relevance. One of which is the practice of cultural intelligence helps you sort of zoom back out and look at the bigger picture. And it helps you understand, in this case, audiences who will be thinking about the world very differently. So if someone of my generation is sitting in a PR or a brand agency, spoiler, I do not think like a 25-year-old. I wish well, sometimes I feel like I do, to be honest. But I'm probably not really tapped into those cultural values, but I need to understand them. I need to be able to engage with them. I need to understand what is important and exciting to them, and then match that with a moment of cultural relevance that can help my brand grow. So cultural intelligence can help you do that. I also think, and I sometimes think we don't talk about this enough, cultural intelligence is a very powerful risk mitigator. So, example from the UK, is that a well-known broadcaster has just pulled I'm trying to think what platform it was on at Beta, but they've just pulled
It's on
something about
TikTok.
women's,
TikTok.
thank you, TikTok. They've just pulled what was supposed to be a channel talking about women and sport. And a lot of women are very upset about how they portrayed that. That's all I'm going to say about that. You can Google it afterwards and read about it from all kinds of sources. But perhaps a little bit of cultural intelligence would have helped mitigate that risk of going into a market or trying to capture a moment that could potentially be culturally a little bit tone deaf in terms of not picking up the nuance, not understanding that people outside whatever research they've done would see that very, very differently. And I think we've probably all seen examples of that where you think, what were they thinking when they did that? And it's not stopping to pause and think about the bigger, outside that little niche audience that you're working with. How might this be perceived? I think organizations and brands that do cultural relevance well are thinking about those things. But I think cultural intelligence is a really great framework for thinking about them more methodically, more intentionally, and with that sort of lens of risk. Like, who have we not heard from on this? Um, I don't want to speculate, but it's possible this particular broadcaster hadn't talked to a lot of women about what they were planning, or maybe they talked to women of a certain kind. So yeah, it's interesting to look at
Mm.
those things that come and go, and also then to think about, I'm not going to say, I was going to say deeper, but that's not the right word, about the cultural values that sit underneath them and why some moments of popular culture or movements don't resonate with everybody, and also who are we excluding from them? Um, because that can cause backlash and it can lead to all kinds of problems. So yeah, a lot to unpack and think about.
That's super interesting. Somebody's just put in the chat, Ada, an example of cultural relevancy could be the Me Too movement.
Mm, yeah, maybe I think there's a lot to unpack in that potentially. But yes, I think that's a movement that um, felt rooted in a moment and a place in time. Um, Maybe unfortunately. I was reading
Mm.
something this week about, have we gone backwards from where we were with the Me Too moment?
And the Me Too movement, as effective as it has been, is very Western mindset,
Yes,
right?
thank you.
It's very Eurocentric and Western focused, and it doesn't really take in consideration the challenges women face outside of the kind of
Yeah.
Western or the global North, as sometimes it's referred to.
Mhm.
So it's just been, I mean, as much as it's made that impact, it's also been hijacked unfairly, it's been misused, and it doesn't take in consideration women who don't fall into a certain demographic sometimes. And actually, it was created by a black woman in America, and
Mm.
and I would say that's not really been acknowledged as much as it should have been. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's lots of different examples out there. You know, brands have got it wrong all the time. Sarah mentioned that one. There was Pringles created pork flavored Pringles for Eid, which is a festival celebrated by Muslim folks. And those of you who are culturally aware will know that Muslim folks don't eat pork generally. But they created pork flavored Pringles. You know, there's things like that. It's not, it just demonstrates that sometimes people have a narrow world view of what is right and don't do their diligence
Yeah.
in recognizing what does this just because it seems right for me, is it right for the
Yeah.
people that we're trying to target? And this is the challenge that a lot of organizations don't
Yeah.
often tap into their cultural intelligence and
Yeah.
realize who, do we have the right voices around the table.
Yeah. And I think cultural intelligence helps you ask better questions. So it helps you think about who's not in this conversation, who have we not consulted with, um, who have we not heard from, um, whose voice is not represented, but also what are the potential, cultural missteps in this, because that should be part of the testing. And I think that's part of the knowledge, but also the strategy, that kind of checking in and trying to find that balanced perspective.
Yeah, it's the framework to stop you making the mistake we were talking about earlier. Um, where you're just not oh, sorry, my brain's completely gone. I think it's the fact that I was up at 1 a.m. in ER with my daughter. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
guys.
you're doing
Quite
very
going
well,
back.
Polly, on so little
Um,
sleep.
Thank you, thank you. It'll come back to me because the point I was going to make was so good and was going to connect with what we were talking about earlier, but it remains somewhere in the depths of my brain. Um, I think what we're going to do now is we're going to consider how what we've been talking about connects with AI, because I think a webinar these days wouldn't be complete without a mention of AI in some way. And
Yeah.
since we're living in this crazy polarized world that we find ourselves in, I know, Sarah, you've done a lot of really deep thinking about CQ and
Mm.
AI, and it would be wonderful if you could share your thoughts about that and about the role CQ plays in media literacy, including AI.
Oh, that's maybe more than we're going to cover in the next 15 minutes, but let's talk about AI first, because we couldn't possibly have a conversation about communications and not talk about AI. Not in today's world. So I have been thinking about cultural intelligence as a compass to help us navigate the new world of AI, which kind of relates back to what Advita was saying about change. And Advita and I had the pleasure of, well, she kind of organized it. I just got to go, the Chartered Institute Public Relations conference last week. And one of the things that I came away with was an even clearer understanding that AI is just a tool for us to use. But it is a lot of change, and there is a lot of scary, and there is a lot of noise about AI. And we all love a new shiny sparkly thing, don't we? Or most of us do. So AI, think about cultural intelligence as a compass. So what's my motivation and my energy about AI? Am I like wildly excited, enthusiast, advocate? And then what's the kind of drive of people that I'm working with? Are they quiet about it because they're fearful? Are they like where are they coming from? What's their motivation? What's their confidence level? And you can have some real tension like both ways. And the other thing is I do like to think of cultural intelligence drive as being like a little fuel gauge. So if you're all fired up and you're really energized and enthusiastic about leaning into difference and different cultures, then you probably got quite high drive. Your tank is full. If you are really struggling to get motivation and the confidence around doing that, don't we often are very self-critical of having that sort of low drive to move forward. But actually, it might be that there's not a lot of psychological safety for you putting yourself out there. There might be something happening that you really are reluctant to speak up. Can be fear, can also be burnout. And I think with the noise around AI, being really mindful about what we're consuming and the voices we're allowing into our head around AI feels like a very important thing at the moment. I think around knowledge, it's not necessarily about how do I use ChatGPT most effectively and how do I write a really smart prompt, though those are things we need to know. It's more perhaps around the ethical questions, the environmental impact, thinking about how it creates um, the kind of community we want to build around AI, the impact on communication. So thinking a lot about do we understand the legislative framework? Really important things, but also thinking about how does AI coincide with my own values? And then looking at strategy, thinking about some of the questions that come up in CQ strategy. Do we, how far does adoption of AI align with my own personal values, with the organizational's values and purpose? Where's the alignment? Where's the fit? Where's the tensions? What's our plan for adopting this? And as we've said before, to what end? If we're creating all this time and saving all this time, what are we doing with it? And then finally, action is how do we bend and flex to adapt to the new world with AI rather than breaking? And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations, for a lot of people. Um, One of the other things is that we've talked today about assumptions and how cultural intelligence helps you to think about assumptions. I think there are some big questions to ask about whose voices are we not hearing in the AI space. Um, and there's been a bit of chat in the news today. I haven't kind of captured all of it, but it's to do with bias in AI and gender bias in AI, which is apparently well, I knew it was a serious issue because I'd done some reading about it, but there's research that it's more serious than I had believed. So things to think about as we adopt and adapt. Um, and I have a paper on that. And if you want to see it, you can message me or go to my website. But yeah, I have a full 45 minutes I can do on that. So that was very quick.
Thanks for the summary. I think it's just useful because it's super interesting
Mhm.
to see how you can apply CQ to this. I don't know if you want to add anything, Advita. It might be time to head towards our takeaways, but it's up to you if you've got something to add. I think we've
No,
got.
I think Sarah captured that perfectly well. Absolutely, and I completely agree. As I always do with Sarah's point of view on AI. Yeah,
We do
100%.
differ occasionally. I didn't speak very much about media literacy or polarization because those are huge topics, but if I could just mention one thing on a couple of things on polarization. Um, a lot of what we talk about in terms of harnessing the potential of cultural intelligence and building these four capabilities that I think are still on the slide, um, is around perspective taking and being able to really understand somebody else's perspective and hold that as loosely as we can without judgment. I will say in a very polarized world, you need to balance that against safety and psychological safety. And whilst we all try and lean in with curiosity and good intent to try and understand, we do have to acknowledge power dynamics. And so there may be times where it is not safe for you to lean into that psychologically, physically, even depending on the context. And that if you are the person who holds more power in a relationship, there is perhaps more responsibility on you to bend and adapt and lean in and ask the curious questions and create the safety for those conversations. The other thing, and again, this goes back to our assumptions. What's our drive if we're in a situation where there's real rub between perhaps two very polarized perspectives? Are we trying to be right? Are we trying to have the last word? Or are we trying to move the conversation forward? So that kind of self-reflection from CQ, I think, is incredibly important. And the other thing, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Hanley Van Wyck, who is a Cultural Intelligence Fellow, um, I had the privilege of interviewing her earlier this year, and she will remind me that not every conversation needs to happen, that we don't have to respond to everything, that we can all scroll on by and choose the moments in which we respond. And again, so often in cultural intelligence, we make the assumption that it's about learning about other cultures and gaining that knowledge. But a lot of the time, it's actually about reflecting on ourselves and our own values and thinking about where it's appropriate and effective for us to engage. So there's a lot more to unpack in that, but I just a couple of things I thought might be worth mentioning to folks.
Thank you, Sarah. Wise words. I think what we really wanted to do was leave everyone with some kind of tangible takeaways. I think this conversation's been so rich, and there's just so much to think about. It can feel a bit overwhelming, like where do I start? So we came up with some takeaways we really thought were the most important things. If we had to boil it down, distill it to just a few things. And magically they fitted into the CQ framework. So, Advita, would you talk through the first two? There are four, obviously.
So, the first one around drive is that kind of curiosity and being able to ask those curious questions and your key motivators for that, right? So, as I said earlier in my when I was answering those questions, is where are the red flags? What are the signals that you're looking for? What is the motivator, not only in yourself, but also in the people that you are communicating with and communicating to? And that's critical for that drive, because you need that. You need the motivators and you need that opportunity to make that change happen. And we laughed earlier about, I used to call myself a certificate chaser, which leads us quite nicely into the knowledge tip, which is you can attend events like this, you can listen to all the podcasts, you can listen or read David Livermore's books, but what are that building that knowledge and understanding is you have to recognize the input that you are contributing. So what is it that you're taking on so you can take the relevant strategy, plan the relevant strategy in action, because we can absorb knowledge. It's what you do with that knowledge that is critically important, and you can fall into the trap of just learning lots and lots and lots around knowledge, but not really doing anything with it. And that is something that we need to be mindful of, because you can, like I said, attend lots of these things, but not really take action. So being mindful of the knowledge and being mindful of what the drivers are, so you can get the right knowledge and the right information, so you can make those decisions that will help you make informative choices around the inclusive cultures that you want to build.
Thanks, Advita. Sarah, can you do the next two takeaways in a couple of minutes?
Oh,
We haven't
yes,
got
very
time for
quickly.
questions.
Strategy, the importance of pausing to think, switching on that second part of your brain system too that we talked about, and then listening critically and with discernment to what we are hearing, being conscious of what you're bringing in and the assumptions that are coming up for you as you hear other people. And then action is bend but don't break. You should never flex to accommodate other people that leaves you in a way that leaves you feeling compromised around who you are. So, we talk about masking, we talk about fitting in. You should always feel that you've been intrinsically true to who you are. Bend where you can, don't break.
That's so important. People so often say to me, but how can I adapt and stay authentic to me? And it's like a perennial question for people, but it's
Yeah.
about finding the way
It,
you can do that.
yeah. And it's back to self-knowledge. Um, and listening to that little voice inside that goes this, like knowing when it's uncomfortable and discomfort is good, and knowing when you've gone too far and you're like, this is really not who I am.
Absolutely. So we have 2 minutes for questions, but I'm
Great.
not seeing any. There was one question about whether the slides will be shared. Very happy to share. Really, the only one you'd want is, I think, the one that's been up on this session, which is the definitions and the framework. So happy to do that. If anyone's got any other quick points they want to make, Sarah Maskell has made an interesting point. I often think about CQ action as being as much about being grounded in reflection than needing to have an action or activity. That in itself is a cultural difference, isn't it? Action feels
Mm.
such a doing thing, but maybe it's more of a
Hmm.
contemplation.
Yep. And sometimes it's
Definitely.
about what you don't do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. We live in a very kind of, I always try and remind people that we are human beings, not human doings, right? So accepting the fact that we will make mistakes, we will get things wrong,
Yeah.
but having that time to reflect, adjust, adapt, who holds the power, who holds the privilege, and how are we helping ourselves be the best selves we can be, and the others
Yeah.
around us be their best self as well. And if we remember that, then we can use the tools around us to make us do good work.
Yeah. Absolutely. And
Thanks.
we are all perfectly imperfect.
Love that.
I love that. Tristan, please can you just whiz us on to the next slide, which just has a little bit of information. If anyone, we haven't had time for questions and more engagement, it would be great if we did. So if anyone has more questions or wants to reach out, please do. You've got a couple of email addresses here, hello@culturalq.co.uk if you're based in the UK. And if you're based anywhere else, you can email info@culturalq.com. And do check out our website, which is culturalq.com, because on there you will eventually find the recording of this webinar, recordings of other webinars, some blogs, some other freebie downloady type things. And mark your calendars too, because we have another webinar coming up on the 3rd of December, which will be about CQ and leadership in changing times. Which promises to be a fantastic conversation hosted by my colleague Eva, who is in Amsterdam but shortly moving to Dubai. So more international representation there.
I
Sarah.
said, so one question really quickly, which is there enough being done? I think I've understood this correctly around cultural intelligence in the global north. I'm going to answer that by saying there's not enough being done about cultural intelligence, full stop.
Anywhere.
Anywhere. We should all have more. I hope that answers it.
True. It's very
Thanks,
true.
Sarah. Good way
And
to end.
just
In less
sorry,
than
Polly,
10 seconds.
I was just going to add, if anybody wants to connect with Sarah and myself as well, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn if there's any
Yeah.
specific questions around communications and CQ that we can support you with.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to chat more at any time.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Polly. Thank you,
everybody.
Tristan.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for being with
much.
us. Thank you.
Thanks.